I think the question is not really the location. The question is how do you work together, the culture you're building, the trust you're making in the team, the effectiveness and productivity of collaboration is important. Like you can be in the same place and have a toxic culture. You can be in the same place and be not productive. You can be in the same place and not be able to brainstorm well and innovate well. Like these are, it's not the location, it's how you operate. And if you operate by being intentional, you go a long way to create an amazing culture.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. Flex Index represents more than 8,000 companies, 60,000 office locations, and 100 million people. Today, my guest is Tony Jamous. Tony is the CEO at Oyster, a platform that allows companies to hire remote talent around the world. In this episode, we dive into how Tony conceived of Oyster in 2019 prior to the pandemic, how he's rapidly scaled a fully remote organization, and how he builds culture without ever getting the full team together in person. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable. It helps new listeners find the podcast. Tony, welcome.
Rob, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for joining me. Tony, I believe you're in Vegas today, but typically you are, I guess, halfway around the world in Cyprus. Have you always lived in Cyprus? I'm curious a little bit more about your background and especially your relationship with tech and building companies in that location.
I actually moved to Cyprus 2.5 years ago. It was a lifestyle move. I was born in Lebanon, which is a country that is 25 minutes flight from Cyprus on the other side of the Mediterranean. And I moved to France when I was a teenager to study computer science. And then in the last 25 years, I lived in the UK and in the US, building technology businesses. And during the pandemic, I realized that I don't have to be in cities anymore to be successful. I wanted to choose where I want to live. And I wanted to be in the island of Cyprus because it's an amazing place, great nature. It is part of the European Union. At least half of the island is part of the European Union, and where you want to put the CEO of Oyster? We are a team of 500 people distributed in 75 countries. We have no offices. So for me to prove that distributed work can work, I have to be in a remote island, and that turned out to be the beautiful island of Cyprus.
I love that bar, by the way. You're like, I've got to prove that this works. The best way for me to do it is to live in an island. I guess it's like a somewhat central island relative to the rest of the world in some ways, right? But tell me, when you moved to Cyprus, what worked in the way you expected? What didn't work? Were there things that, lifestyle-wise or operating a company-wise were just very different than you expected and you had to acclimate to it?
What worked really is remote work for me there, like because I would have I don't work in the morning, so I work in the evening and the afternoon. So I have my morning to take care of everything I need to do in my life, uh, and and the fact that I can be productive from there. I can be highly productive because you've adopted at Oyster this way of working remotely that can make us successful no matter where we are. Um, what is a little bit kind of I would say challenging is the feeling of isolation because the island is tiny. There's million and a half, less than 1.5 million people on the island, and I live even in a more remote area of the island, closer to the sea. And so sometimes I have to travel. Like today, I'm traveling for 18 days around the world to see my team and be at events. But it's always great to be back home.
That's great. And let's rewind a little bit. So we were talking about where you live today. You mentioned a little bit about Oyster, but Oyster is not your first company. You've been around technology for a long time and built companies before. Let's talk a little bit about your career and would love to talk a little bit about Nexmo too, and then we can get into Oyster and some of the things you're doing today. So maybe rewind the clock for us and tell me a little bit about how you got into technology and some of your early experiences there.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to work in the as a mobile telecommunication industry. When I was a teenager growing up uh, in a war-torn Lebanon, we didn't have a communication network, so we used these these CB radios, radio communication devices that were the only available way to communicate. And I got really obsessed with this technology. And so when I moved to France, I wanted really to study telecommunication. And my first two jobs were really in selling software solution that are for mobile technologies. And that led me 13 years ago to start my first technology company called Nexmo. Was an API business for building communication applications, essentially creating a very simple API to connect all the telecom carriers in the world and remove the barriers for a software developer to innovate with a telecom network. That grew rapidly, so went to 100 million of revenue in the first 5 years. Took it public in mid 2016, and then eventually was acquired by Ericsson for $6.5 billion 2 years ago. And so I left that business. I took some time off. I was in my late 30s, so I wanted to really calibrate what I'm going to do next. I wanted to start another business, but this time it had to be a mission-driven business, a business that connects with my purpose. And that led me to start Oyster in January 2020 as an employment platform that is on a mission to distribute opportunity around the world, reverse brain drain, reducing wealth inequality by democratizing access to global job opportunities. So that was 4 years ago.
I think the timing is so interesting about that because you started in January 2020. One of the things I was wanting to ask you was, at that point in time, was there any thought process around the pandemic? I mean, COVID was kind of starting to materialize in some markets, but in the US, for example, it didn't really start to hit until March of 2020 or so. So was it just fortuitous timing in a way in terms of your own thought process around this opportunity in technology and enabling remote work? Was there a COVID input to it, or how did that manifest?
I started researching this opportunity in mid 2019, and I knew that remote work will be massive. I did not know it's going to be that quickly adopted. That was a surprise, and the macro opportunity is much bigger actually than remote work. We're talking about 85 million jobs going unfulfilled in the West. According to BCG, that's 8.5 trillion economical loss, around 10% of the world economy. While at the same time, you have over 1 billion knowledge workers coming into the workforce in the next 10 years, mostly from the emerging economy. So it was clear to me that this is going to happen. The pandemic was just an accelerator of what is already started to happen.
So tell me a little bit about the early days of Oyster. I imagine you get started and then all of a sudden the world turns upside down and what you're building is in tremendous demand relative to some of the topics that you were just describing. What was it like in the early days building that early team and trying to run at a speed to keep up with what was happening in the world around you?
It was exactly what I did not expect because, I was hoping I'm going to have this honeymoon period in startups where it's fun, you're iterating, you're making mistakes, and you don't have customers yet. That didn't happen for us. We went straight directly into customers. We didn't have technology to sell them in the beginning. So it was done by humans. We replaced software by humans in the beginning because the demand was so high and we didn't have time to really build scalable software. We reached 1 million of ARR without technology. And then we started replacing humans with technology over time. We moved from 0% automated to 80% automated in 4 years. And we still have the path to get to 100%. But it was a very, very interesting moment because we achieved product market fit before having a product.
It's funny that you say that. I was going to ask you a question about product market fit. And I was going to say, if as an entrepreneur, I'm curious, if you get to 1 million in ARR and you don't have a product that's at least not in the form that you think of, did you think of it as product market fit, or did it feel like you kind of knew that the technology would get there to be able to support it, or did it give you pause at all in terms of the way you were thinking about operating and pace and such?
We were so lucky to have had the opportunity to interact with hundreds of customers before even building the product. that created our product roadmap. It's really this interaction, this manual interaction with the customers, and giving them the impression that there was an interface, and behind the scene it was manual. So being able to really get real-time feedback of what your technology roadmap should be was an accelerator for our growth. Today we built we have an employment infrastructure in 180 countries. We can employ people, give them compliant contract. We automate all the employment contract in 180 countries. You can give them benefits. You can give them equity. We process payment and payroll in all these currencies. It's softwareizing global employment is a pretty massive technological challenge. That's why this category is so valuable, because we're solving a major challenge in the world. Think about all these various regulation of employment laws, taxes for payroll, payment infrastructure. So it is it was a blessing for us to have this opportunity to connect real time with the pain of the customer as we're building the company.
That makes sense. And your product roadmap probably hewed much more closely to what you knew needs were as a result. Did you always expect the company to be fully remote, or was that a impacted at all by the speed at which you maybe need to hire or grow relative to that opportunity movement?
It was intentional from day one. Actually, I was working with my co-founder in mid 2019 before thinking about Oyster, and he asked me the question, what are the conditions for you to come back to work, to want to work? So I was going through my journey. Okay, do I want to work? I don't have to work, but if I want to work, what are the conditions? So number one was I wanted flexibility. I wanted to work in a place that I love to live in. I don't want to live in cities anymore. I wanted to move to Cyprus. I wanted to have the time and flexibility to be there for my loved ones. I don't want to burn out. I want to be able to travel less. I was traveling half of my time changing continent because we had to go to the office to get stuff done in the past. I wanted to work with people that are from all over around the world. I wanted to be surrounded with diversity. And at Oyster, we are from 100 different nationalities, distributed in 70 countries, gender equal. It is just such a rich environment to be surrounded by people from all over the world. And I wanted also to create an opportunity for people in emerging economies. So these were kind of my conditions to work. And so I created Oyster to address my needs of flexibility, my needs of freedom, my needs of impact and purpose. And it turned out these are not only my needs, these are everybody's needs. Everybody wants freedom, flexibility, and fulfillment.
Did you use Oyster in the early days, or at least the idea of what Oyster was going to be in hiring those first folks? Or was that part of the learning process for you in different countries of how you needed to set up and operate and where there were pain points, in addition to what you were hearing from prospective customers at the time?
Absolutely. We are the first customer of Oyster. We are the first and biggest customer and the most innovative customer of Oyster. We have people all over the world, and we are really pushing the boundary of what it means to be a great human-centric employer in a distributed way.
So to that effect, a couple questions I want to ask around the onboarding and kind of cultural affiliation process for an organization like yours that both is fully remote and grew really quickly. And obviously from an onboarding and some of the documentation and what it means to set up in different countries, and that's Oyster's core business, right? You're very thoughtful around those topics. As you thought about what it meant to onboard people to the culture of Oyster and the value set and to build relationships in such a distributed and multi-location type of environment, are there certain approaches or practices you started to put in place in terms of how you started to be able to bring folks in and make it feel like one organization?
Absolutely. We are very intentional in three things, really. One is building trust in the organization. So we train people on that during their onboarding process. How do you assume best intent? How do you reduce your reactivity to negative news? And how do you commit to having psychological safety in the workplace? So building trust is critical in a distributed setting because you don't see people in seats. You have to trust them that they are doing a great job. Secondly is about being intentional about how do you work in the company. We call them the Oyster operating system. These are tools and rules that dictate when do you use tool for what purpose. So when do you use Google Docs? When do you use Notion for documentation? When do you use a recorded video? How do you prepare for a meeting? How do you do a meeting? Um, and that's also part of the training, the onboarding process. So people, when they join, they learn how we work here, and that becomes a foundation of the culture. How we work here, but also how do we interact with each other? How do we care to each other? How do we work together? And lastly is being intentional about what success is on an individual level, on a team level, and a company level, because when you wake up in Manila on the other side of the world and your boss is 12 hours difference from you, how do you know what you need to do today? What guides you is clarity of what success look like. And three things. So building trust, being clear about how you work and intentional, and being intentional about having clear goals and expectations is what we did to, these were the foundation that we used to create this culture. And by the way, any company, by having these three components, can become a better company. It doesn't have to be a distributed company.
I think what you just said around being prescriptive is really interesting. And you talked about being prescriptive around how to run meetings and what does a meeting look like and what documents you use. Do you feel like fully remote organizations have to be more deliberate and intentional on exactly how work gets done than other organizations and that maybe are hybrid or full-time in office, for example? And how do you balance the specificity or the value that comes from that specificity with creativity and giving the organization opportunities to be innovative in terms of thinking about tools and practices and other things that might help move the organization forward?
Yeah, so look, business is a lot around creating standards, creating procedures, processes. So when it's about these regular tasks, it's better to have a clear process. But often you also have the opportunity to work on a non-structured subjects or brainstorm together as a team. And in a remote setting, you need to be intentional about creating these brainstorm opportunities. You want to recreate the water cooler conversation in a much more structured and engaging way. So we have tools for that. So we detect, is this a meeting that requires us to prepare in advance, read the documentation, and come to a decision, let's say, or is it a meeting that is more open-ended meeting that's about brainstorming and building on each other idea? So by detecting the type of the meeting, we can use the appropriate tool and create an environment where creativity can be fostered intentionally.
Are there other elements of the infrastructure, for lack of better description, that you create around the company, whether it be around certain processes or tooling, that you have found you've invested more heavily in than you would have expected or needed to be more intentional or deliberate in, given the nature of distribution of employees and what it means to operate fully remotely?
Yeah, so a few things. One is our objective key results process is much more advanced and mature than company of our stage. Our planning and strategy process as well is much more mature because again, we're working across multiple time zone. We have to coordinate a lot of moving pieces. Our other areas is in global compensation. You know, how do you fairly compensate and transparently compensate workforce distributed in 70 countries, right? So all these things kind of push the limit of what is possible, and we were able to go above and beyond on this. And now we're turning them into products. Our compensation philosophy now is part of our product because our customers are facing the same problem. You know, here it is. I have to say, culture, eat strategy for breakfast is very real in this industry because we are the role model for our customers. So we have to be the best at being distributed in order for us to be credible to our customer base.
it strikes me that there's a certain process orientation that probably is required to be successful in the Oyster culture and the way that you describe it in terms of this is how we do certain things. We're very structured in the way we think about everything from strategy to measurement to the way that we interact. Have you found that employees have an easy time adjusting to that, or is there certain types of folks that you've selected for that you think are better for that experience because of past experience in remote work or certain types of companies? Or how have you in some ways expressed that preference through recruiting and onboarding to make it you find folks that fit well in that type of construct?
I believe this model is more inclusive than the other model, which is to leave it for chance of how to guess what you're expected to behave here, how you're expected to work here. So if you remove a layer of uncertainty at work, you reduce the anxiety for people, and people feel much happier at their work. Because for me, I look at work as another source of stress in our life, another source of anxiety in our life. So what needs to happen for organization to minimize the impact of the unnecessary stressors that work can bring, such as commuting? Like, why do you need commuting anymore in knowledge work, right? Why do you need to stress to come to the office at a certain hour? Another example is why do you need to do synchronous live meeting without preparation, where people are for the first time seeing the news and reacting to the news and not able to process it? But if you do it in advance and you consume the asynchronous documentation, you process your emotion, you come much more ready and calm and present to the meeting. So all of these little things add up to create a much healthier environment for humans than the office. The office is also, we know that offices can be toxic in terms of politics, and here it's much less politics in remote work because you're not seeing the person in the office. You don't have these unconscious emotional reactions that we see when we're in the same place. Like when we're in the same place with humans, we get triggered because we have fear coming up. It's a physical, somatic fear coming from our past traumas, but we are reacting it at work. But when we're on Zoom, it's much less powerful. We don't feel it as much. So it is a better environment for human mental health. Except isolation, because remote work can lead to feeling of isolation, obviously. So we can talk about it, how we hedge against that or mitigate that. But it's also an opportunity for growth, because if you learn how to be with yourself, you can actually you become happier. If you're more in peace with who you are.
So let's dig into that. How do you solve for some of those elements of isolation or feeling lonely in an environment where there could be no one else in your country, for example, that is working at the same company?
Yeah, like Cyprus. I'm the only employee in Cyprus. There's nobody else. So
you need to improve your Cyprus recruiting efforts. I feel like you need to build some scale.
Yes, I agree. So look, on the question of isolation. So we thrive to create more connection and bonding at Oyster, and people at Oyster tells me that they've never felt so much belonging to a workplace that is Oyster, that is not physical. And how we do that, we thrive to create daily connections. So we have a lot of thematic Slack channels by theme. If you like, there's pet channel, for instance. There are good morning channel every day. Everybody comes and say good morning, share some pictures about what's going on in their life. So you feel a bit more connected to people. But we also have like we train people when they do their one-to-ones with their manager, with their teams, is to connect with them on the personal level. It's not only about getting stuff done, because we already process the information before the meeting. So it becomes an opportunity for us to connect on the personal level with the person and check in with them. We also do monthly all hands. We have every year we do a virtual event for a week where we connect from all over the world. So there's a lot of things we can do in the company to lessen that feeling of isolation and create a broader belonging feeling. Now, I want to say also, it's an opportunity to rethink how we socialize, because when we were forced to commute to the office, well, we had no other choice than to socialize at work, because we had to spend an hour to go to the office and come back, and spend 8 hours in the office. Essentially, all of our day would be in the office. But today, you can socialize with your local community. You can socialize, you can be with your family, with your loved ones closer. So your socialization needs don't have to be fulfilled only through work. And the other opportunity that I experienced was that, well, now I'm alone, working alone in this country. So how can it be okay to be alone? So I went on this journey of self-connection that enabled me to become happier in my life, where it's about self-love, self-compassion, self-forgiveness, self-confidence, desirability, self-gratitude, self-confidence. We said that. So essentially, kind of nurturing these practices enabled me to become happier in my life. So essentially, it became like my therapy to find new avenues of connection that is mostly about self-connection.
How did you go through that process? And I imagine there are other employees at the company who are interested in going through a similar journey. Have you tried to turn that into something culturally or organizationally, support employees in going through a similar thought process?
Well, we do have a mental health challenge that we support people on, where people anonymously can come and ask for support. We also have a therapist on call. Every employee can have access to a therapist if they need to. And we strive to create a culture that is highly safe emotionally by building trust, not reacting to bad news, assuming best intent, and other practices that enable people to not be afraid to be who they are and to be vulnerable sometimes, and be seen and heard going through challenges.
Do you ever bring everyone together in person at any point in the year? Or I know you do a lot of travel, for example. I assume you visit team members in person, but does the whole group or subsets of the whole group get together in person?
Unfortunately, no, because it's pretty costly to move 500 people to one location. I hope one day that's something we will do, but at the moment, it's not a prudent investment to do that. Instead, we supplement with a virtual event every year. But also, I strive to go around the world, meet a lot of our colleagues. We call them pearls, and my team, my leadership team, meets
I love
every.
that, by the way. Pearls is great.
Mm, yeah, I love them too. So yeah, so we meet once or twice a year in my team.
One thing I'm curious to get your perspective on, especially given your experience as an entrepreneur, and you've obviously been quite successful both with Oyster and in the past. I've noticed in the investor community, especially in venture capital, still a fairly strong preference for teams to get together in person, whether you're a fully remote organization, making sure that you're intentional in things like offsites, or even a lot of a push in the early days of co-locating folks and getting them to be in person a lot. Um, you're obviously an example of that not being required necessarily to kind of build that model. But are you seeing similar things? And when you have conversations with either your investors or others, how do you describe how you think about what's required to form a company and the role of location or co-location and being successful in the early days?
I think the question is not really the location. The question is how do you work together, the culture you're building, the trust you're making in the team, the effectiveness and productivity of collaboration is important. Like you can be in the same place and have a toxic culture. You can be in the same place and be not productive. You can be in the same place and not be able to brainstorm well and innovate well. Like these are, it's not the location, it's how you operate. And if you operate by being intentional, you go a long way to create an amazing culture, and you can go fast. You can be innovative. I mean, at Oyster, we went from zero to $1 billion of market cap in 3 years. One of the fastest growing company in the history of software as a service. We did that by being everywhere in the world. So if we cannot innovate and cannot be productive, this would not be possible. I think the question is, like both companies, whether it's in office, both setup, whether in office or remote, can be productive and can be innovative. The question is, at what cost? right? Do you really want to tax people, force them to commute? You want to reduce their degree of freedom and flexibility unnecessarily. That's a cost that you'll pay, and as a result of that, businesses that don't offer this degree of freedom and flexibility are losing their best talent towards a company that they are offering these options.
And we found something similar in our Flex Index data. We had done a report, I think in mid 2023, that found that the companies that were hiring or growing faster typically were the ones that were embracing some level of flexibility, especially relative to companies that are full-time in office. One question I had in that regard is, you talked a lot about the practice and the intentionality around Oyster, from everything from onboarding to the way that you build trust to the way that you set goals. I imagine a lot of things are working given the scaling of the business and the success. What isn't working? Or maybe put a different way, even, are there things that are really high priority for you in the next year or 2 years to improve about your fully remote practice and how you operate in your culture, that maybe are super top of mind or worth spending a few minutes talking about?
Yeah, so for me, it's a journey of continuous improvement. So for instance, an example would be our degree of asynchronous collaboration. Can we push that further? I'd like my team, my C-level, C executives, to be the best remote workers in my company, to model the way for others in the team. So I want them all to keep learning and evolving and changing. That's one of the challenges I'm facing. So we also need to continue to improve our diversity, right? So we're already hyper diverse, but if it's not managed intentionally, then we might lose that. So we are gender equal across the company, and we want to maintain that, and we want to create more dispersity around the world. How can we shift more our focus in elevating talent from countries that this is required?
I want to go back to the point you made around executive team, because I think that's interesting, the idea of holding them up as wanting to be the best remote workers. Is it a standard question in terms of, I just want our executive team to be the best, and that means constantly raising the bar? Or are you finding it is more challenging in some ways with executives that maybe have worked in different types of environments to fully acclimate to the experience of remote, or somewhere in between? I'm curious what you're seeing.
Yeah, the challenge is at least what we're seeing is less about the commitment of the people and more of the nature of the task that executive team have to solve on a day-to-day basis. It is usually an ambiguous, complex task that is multifaceted, and asynchronous work is less effective for that than the more standardized task where everything is well, it's more defined, where the task is more defined. Asynchronous work can be perfect for that. So think about, coding, writing line of code. Asynchronous work can be amazing for this. But think about deciding how you want to respond to a competitor move. You might want to have more sync time to be able to address that. So the executive team's adoption of remote work is more challenging than the rest of the company, and we need to be empathic to these leaders that are really doing their best. They're committing to get there, but the nature of their task make it more challenging. So that's why it's always continuous improvement in that area, and we always discover new ways that we can use async with. We can always push the limit of async further, and be more intentional of choosing when do we work async and when we work in synchronous way.
And how do you measure it? Are you looking at the amount of time that's spent asynchronously versus synchronously? Are you looking at it at different levels? For example, what does it look like at our executive level versus mid-level managers? I'm curious how you think about where and kind of like what data you use to understand where to push async work versus the recognition that some things require more synchronous thought, relative to complexity, ambiguity of topic.
Yeah, so we have expectations of when of type of meeting. So there's a meeting that requires you to prepare things for 48 hours in advance, circulate them to the team, I measure the engagement level of my executive team into this asynchronous documentation. Did they read it? Did they engage in it? Did you have a fruitful conversation before we come into the meeting? Are the meeting there's clear goals of the meeting? So all of these things are measurable, and we can see when they work well and when they need to improve.
So it sounds like a lot of you can measure the different steps of the process around a meeting, pre, during, et cetera, to better understand how optimal we are and where there are opportunities maybe to use more async or improve the way you engage on a topic.
Yeah. And I have to say, like, these are the most productive meeting I've ever had in my job as a CEO for the last 20 years, right? So in the past, imagine I had to change continent to move from my office in San Francisco to my office in London to do a meeting. Just imagine that world that we used to live in. So now it's so much more productive.
So let's talk about that and the way the world is evolving. I think in our data, we see roughly about 7% of companies are fully remote. When we look on an industry weighted basis in the US and across our broader Flex Index database, I think it's about the same. As you might imagine, that's pretty heavily skewed toward smaller companies. Under 500 employees, we see substantially higher rates of fully remote work versus Fortune 500 or larger scale type companies. Where do you think we're headed? Is fully remote going to be more mainstream? Is it just going to be in pockets within all organizations, somewhere else? Curious what your read is on the market over the coming years and the evolution of this area.
Yeah. So in the long term, I believe that remote work is going to become work because we're moving into a world where knowledge work will be the predominant work. There's 1 billion knowledge worker coming into the workforce in the next 10 years, mostly from emerging economy. That's the biggest demographic shift in workers' demographics since the Industrial Revolution. So remote work will be work in the future, and the speed in which that's going to be adopted is going to be determined on economical cycles. If we are in a recession, then the adoption will be slower. If the market reaccelerates, the adoption will be faster because the best talent, they know that they can have this degree of flexibility and freedom. And they are navigating around companies that give them that flexibility and freedom and can make them successful as well. So over time, the best companies in the world will become distributed companies. But I have to say that that's for remote work. Remote work will become work. But the key is more global employment. Global employment is going to be employment in the future because there's over 10% of the economy gone unfulfilled because companies in the West are unable to fulfill these jobs. So they're going to go find them elsewhere. They're going to be such a economical pressure for them to go find them elsewhere. And now with platforms like Oyster, their world is their oyster when they're looking for talent. They don't have to be concerned about where they want to hire. They can hire anywhere.
So I guess in some ways, if I think about what you're saying and tell me if you would agree with this or if I'm thinking about the right way, it almost sounds like this is a two-step process that don't necessarily have to happen sequentially, but effectively, the argument is all companies are becoming more distributed, and that will continue to happen inexorably based on distribution of where knowledge workers are, different markets, global talent, et cetera. And that naturally leads to the need to be great at remote work because you're not with the same person in the same office. And fully remote is really a question of, do you have offices in that location or not in terms of the nature of it? But it's hard to argue with, it seems like, the idea that we are moving toward more and more distributed work and have been there, not just in the last few years, but it seems like decades moving in that direction with globalization.
Yeah, it's going to go exponentially. The pandemic accelerated things, shaked up things, but the direction is clear. This is where the world is headed, and it's hard to imagine that in 20, 30 years, we're going to all be working in offices.
Any other projections for where we're headed around remote work or more broadly based on where you sit at Oyster and the way you think about this topic?
Yeah, I think that empathic, human-centric leadership is going to be critical the next phase. I think people are realizing that there's more to work than just a paycheck, and they're looking to join an organization that care deeply about their core needs and give them a purpose and fulfillment in their work. This is where I think we're going to see a change, an acceleration in the trend. And at Oyster, we're blessed being a mission-driven company. We are a B Corp on a mission to make the world more free and equal by democratizing access to global job opportunities, and can be more excited to be driven by this mission.
So, final question for you. If people want to learn more about Oyster, or if they want to read more of your thinking and the work that you're doing on this topic, where would you send them?
Yeah, so you can go on our website, oysterhr.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, Tony, I really appreciate the time. I think the work that you're doing is fantastically interesting, both in terms of the seat that you hold at Oyster and the way that Oyster is pushing the envelope for companies to be able to think about what it means to hire globally and build more distributed teams, but also because you're a really successful repeat entrepreneur, and the lessons that you bring from building companies in the past, and the way that you experienced that personally in moving to Cyprus, for example, I think are really interesting. So thanks for sharing some of those pearls, forgive me, of wisdom with us. And I think everybody would really enjoy some of the things you had to say and learning about that.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.